By now you should have a pretty reasonable grasp on how to build web pages and how to use CSS. I'm going to invite you to a little coding challenge. I'll show you what I want you to build out, and then I want you to use the things that we've learned in our class up until this point and try to build out a page that looks like mine. Here's the page that I'm challenging you to build. This page is using many of the principles that we have covered up until this point. We of course are using semantic markup, and then we're using many of the CSS properties that we've been covering to be able to build a page where the layout is going to look something like this. You can see I have a navigation up at the top, and as I scroll, the navigation stays fixed. Notice that the navigation has a drop shadow, and I have hover styles on all of my links. If we go down to this section of the page, you'll see that the image is appearing on the right, and then the text is wrapping around the image. It is worth noting that this is actually two separate images. We have the jellyfish, and then we have the picture of the water. Think about the different sorts of ways that we could get these to sit on top of each other. As we scroll down farther on the page, you can see that I have images and I have a caption underneath each of the images. I solved this by using some of the position properties in order to get the caption to sit over the image. And then finally, down at the bottom of the page, I have another fixed element. This is my footer. And in addition to the text, I have this little icon. The icon is sitting right on top of the footer background. Here's what the page looks like at a large screen size. You'll see that the footer stays at the very bottom of the page. If the page is resized, where we would need to scroll, you can see that the elements on the page come up from underneath the footer. The same thing is happening up at the top in the navigation. The content slides behind the navigation element. Think of the different ways you're able to accomplish this. Building something like this should challenge you and give you an opportunity to practice many of the things that we have accomplished. If you want to give this a try, go ahead and pause the video and then try to build something out like this. When you're ready, you can rejoin me and I'll explain how I solved this particular problem. How did you do? Hopefully you gave the challenge a try. First, I'll go through the HTML that I used to build this page, and then if you want to attempt to do the CSS, if you haven't done that yet, I would again invite you to pause the video, give it a try, and then join me to see my solution. Let's see how I did the HTML. How I started building this page is I began by linking to my reset file. This of course just resets and removes any of the default formatting that the browser applies to the various elements. Then I went ahead and I linked to my own style file. We'll be filling this out as we go through this particular web page. On to the body. I started off by creating a nav element, and I used an unordered list that contains links, and this serves as my navigation. Then I went ahead and made a section element. Inside the section, I used an H1 and an H2. This is followed by an article, and I gave this first article a class of intro. In the article, I'm using both the jellyfish and the background image. I assigned each of these images classes so that I could target them with CSS. Then I have a couple paragraphs of text. Next, I have another article. This has a class of animals. Inside of this article, I have 5 figure elements, each with their own unique class name. Each figure element contains an image and a fig caption. Then after the closing section tag, I have a footer, and my footer contains the image of the whale along with a paragraph of text. That's it for my HTML. And you can see, without any CSS, this is what my page currently looks like. If you need to make any changes to your HTML, I invite you to once again pause the video, fix up your HTML, and then give the CSS a try on your own. When you're ready, come back to the video, and then we can work through the CSS together. I did make one change to the reset file. We talked about the reset file in an earlier video. What I'm doing here is I'm going to go ahead and after all of the HTML elements, I went ahead and added the box sizing of border box property. Remember, this is the property that allows the padding to not increase the overall width of an element. I prefer to use this on all of my elements, so I just like to incorporate this into the reset. I'll save the reset and then I'll close this. Moving on to the style.css, I started off with some basic styles on some of our basic elements. These don't do that much other than just set the font size and set some margin settings. So when I refresh my page, you can see how I have a little bit of spacing and some of the text is sized a little bit differently. Now let's get into building the page. I'm going to start working from the top down. I'll start off by making a rule on my navigation element. For this particular element, I'm going to set the background color. I set this to a teal color, and then I'm going to set the font color to white. Next thing that I'm going to do is add a box shadow. I'm going to use 0 for the horizontal offset, 4 pixels for the vertical offset, 2 pixels for the blur, and for the color I'm going to use black with a very low alpha. I'm setting the padding all the way around to 0.5 ems. I'm setting the margin on the bottom to 1 em. Next, I'm going to use my text align center. If we save and refresh, you can see these changes being applied to the navigation. Because I want the navigation to always be visible, I'm going to use my position sticky. And then I'm going to tell the top value to be 0, so it always stays at the top of the page. Next, I'll target the list items. Because I want the lists to display horizontally, I'm going to use my display of inline block. As you probably recall, this will allow elements to appear side by side instead of having the default behavior of the block elements stacking on top of each other. Next, I'm going to target the anchor tags within the nav element. The first thing that I'm going to do is change the color to white. I'm going to use text decoration of none to remove the underline, and I'm going to set padding all the way around of 1 em. Next, I'll make a rule for the hover state of the links. All I'm going to do here is set the color to be a light shade of blue. If we save now and refresh, you can see that the navigation is now styled in the way that I want it to look. When we scroll our page, the additional content is going to slide underneath the navigation, and that is a result of us using the position sticky. Let's move on to the next area of the page. The next area that I'm going to target is the main section. What we're going to do here is we're going to set the overall width of the section to 80%. Then I'm going to use a little trick that initially seems a little odd, but I would like to center the section as a unit in the middle of my page. In order to do that, we use a margin auto on the right and the left. If you use margin auto on the top and the bottom, it won't have any effect. But the important part to remember is that when you want something to be centered as a unit, you will use margin auto. If I make my page fairly large, you can see that I have space that appear on the right and the left side of the screen. You'll notice how the navigation element is not affected by this. Because I'm setting the overall width of the section to 80%, it will allow the content, once the page is large enough anyways, to fit within this section, and then the available space is going to appear on the right and the left. Now, if my page is more narrow, I will get a horizontal scroll bar. The reason why is my picture is fairly wide. This is actually forcing the necessity for more horizontal space. Once we set our CSS, we will resolve this issue. I'm going to target the intro article, which is the first article on our page. For the intro article, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set padding all the way around of 1 em. Then I'll set margin bottom of 2 ems. Then I'll set a border bottom, and I'm going to use solid, 1 pixel, and I'll specify that same teal color that we're using in our navigation element. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to target the circle class. This is the image that contains the water. I'm going to set both the width and the height to 300 pixels. Then I'll use border radius of 50%. This will allow this element to display as a circle. If we save and we refresh, you can see how this image is displaying in a circular formation, which is what I want. Now I want to move the circular image over to the right, and I want the text to wrap around it. In order to do that, we're going to use our float right. To make the text flow around it, I'm going to use the shape outside property, and we're going to set that to circle, and in the parentheses, we'll pass in 50%. Finally, I'm going to set my margin left to 1em. If we save our page and we refresh in the browser, you can see how the circular image is over to the right and the text is starting to wrap around it. At this point, the jellyfish image is also being affected by the float. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we are going to move the jellyfish. I want to position the jellyfish right here inside of the circle. So what I'm going to do temporarily is I'm going to turn on a border on my article intro. We'll be getting rid of this in just a moment, but I do want to show you where the confines of this element are. I think this will help you visualize what's happening when we target the .jelly item. For .jelly, I'm going to use a position of absolute. I want to absolutely position this element. I'm going to set the right property value to 0, as well as the top property value to 0. Now, if we save our page currently and we refresh, the jellyfish image is being positioned based on the ancestor at the top level, which is the body element. Because none of the other ancestors have any sort of position, this is where it will position from. I actually want to position it based off of the article intro element. I'm going to come back to this element and I'm going to use position relative. Remember, this is like turning on a switch. When I refresh this, you can see that the jellyfish now moves to the right hand and the top edge of the red bordered box. Now that I have the jellyfish in this position, all I need to do is adjust the values so I can push it over slightly to the left and down a little bit. I'll use 80 pixels for the right and 40 pixels for the top. If we save now and refresh, you can see how the jellyfish is positioned in the center of the circle. If I resize my page, the jellyfish is going to remain in that particular location, which is exactly where we want it to be. At this point, I no longer need the border red, so I'm going to get rid of that. Now, if my page is wide, you're going to see how the jellyfish and the circle hang over this border bottom on the article. We actually don't want that to happen, so we're going to use the trick with the pseudo element of after, and we are going to target our article intro after, and we're going to apply a clear there. I'll set empty content, the display to block, and we'll add a clear of both. If we save now and refresh, you can see how the bottom of the intro article now goes underneath the circle, which is where we want it to be. Let's move on to the next section of the page. To start off with, we're going to target the figure elements. We want these to appear side by side. So we have several methods of doing that. We can either use float or we can use the display of inline block. As you learn more and more about CSS, you'll find that there's various ways to accomplish the same sort of task. It's not to say that one way is better than the other. You're just going to have to experiment and find the way that works best and makes the most sense to you. For this particular example, I'm going to use a display of inline block. I'll also set the margin all the way around of 0.5 ems. If we save and refresh, you'll notice that now the figure elements are going to appear side by side. As my page gets wider and it can accommodate multiple figure elements, they will continue to appear until all 5 of them can be on one row. If the page is more narrow, they will move down to the subsequent rows. As you can see, by default, these elements are lining to the left. I would prefer them to be center aligned. Since these elements are inline block, we can control that behavior by adding a rule to the article.animals element and telling it to have a text align of center. If I save now and we refresh, you can see how these animals adjust and now appear in the middle of the page. In addition to the elements appearing in the center, the fig captions also appear centered, which is what I want. Now what we want to do is we want to take the fig captions and we want them to appear at the lower part of the image. We're going to go ahead and style them so they have a partially transparent background. I'll go ahead and I'll target the fig caption elements. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the background color. I'm going to use RGBA values so that I can give them a partial transparency. We'll set the color to white and then we're going to set it to 70%. Next, I'm going to set the padding on these elements. The padding is going to be 0.5 ems. To get these elements to be positioned at the lower part of the figure tag, we're going to need to add a position relative to the figure and then use position absolute on the fig caption. I know I want the fig captions to appear at the bottom portion of the figure tag, so I'll set the bottom to 0. If we save now and we refresh, you can see how these elements are displaying in the proper location. The only problem is they're only as wide as they need to be based on the text that they contain. In order to get these to span the entire width of the parent element, I'm going to add a width of 100% to the fig caption. If we save and refresh our page, you can see that now they span over the bottom part of the image. Because we're using a partial transparency, we can see a little bit of the image behind the semi-transparent white background. This part of our page is now looking good. Now we'll move on to the footer. I'll start off by setting the background color on my footer. Then I'm going to set the text color to white. For this particular element, I'm going to use a text align right because I want the text to appear on the right-hand side. I'm also going to use a margin top of 2 ems. We'll set some padding all the way around. I'm going to use 1 em for the top, 1 em for the right and the left, and 0.5 ems for the bottom. If we save now and we refresh, you can see how the footer now has this background color and the text is appearing on the right and white. Now what we need to do is we need to move the little whale so it appears like it's sitting on top of the footer. In order to do that, I'm going to use position. So I'm going to tell the footer element to have a position of relative. I want to position the whale based on the footer. To target the whale, I'm going to use footer img, and we're going to tell this to position absolute. And usually when I'm doing this, I like to just set the values that I know I want to 0, and then from there I can make adjustments. So if I set top and right to 0, 0, you can see that it's going to go ahead and place the whale image on the right and at the top. Now we know we want to pull it up higher, so that's going to involve us using negative numbers. I'm going to go ahead and use negative 45 pixels for the top, and for the right I'm going to just push it in a little bit. I will use 10 pixels for the right. If we refresh now, you can see that the whale is sitting right on top of the footer and it's slightly indented from the right hand side. This is perfect. Now, this looks pretty good when my page is this size. If we make the page smaller and I scroll, you're going to see that there is a problem. The content in the first article is appearing on top of the navigation. Do you remember what we need to do to fix this? Remember that we need to adjust the Z index. So if I go back up to the navigation element, I'm going to simply add a Z index, and anything higher than 0 will work. I'll just set it to 5. And now, if I refresh my page, you can see how the content is sliding behind the navigation, which is what we want. This looks pretty good. You will notice that currently my footer is not visible until I scroll all the way down to the bottom. We do want the footer to work similarly to how the navigation is working, so we're going to want that to always be present. In order to do that, I'm going to come down to my footer element, and instead of using a position of relative, we're going to use a position of fixed. In addition to position fixed, I need to tell the footer where to be. So I'm going to set the bottom value to 0. If we save now and we refresh, you're going to see that the footer is apparent and it does stay visible when I scroll, but there is an issue. The footer is only as big as it needs to be to wrap the content. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a width property to the footer, and I'm simply going to set that to 100%. Now, if I save and we refresh our page, the footer is doing what we need it to do. There is one more problem though, and that is the fact that when my page is wide, this looks fine. But as my page gets more narrow and the figure images are appearing behind the footer, we don't see the fig caption. We don't see the bottom part of those elements. In order to fix this, we're going to need to add some margin to the article animals. So I'm going to come to the article animals and we're going to simply add a margin bottom. You may need to play around with the values so that you can find what number is going to work. I think 8ems should do the trick. If I refresh now, then you can see that I have plenty of room at the bottom and I'm able to scroll a little bit farther than I need to, which allows me to be sure that I can read all of the information on the web page. As you can see, we have incorporated many of the principles that we've been using up until this point. I did want to show you how we could combine these and how they might work together in a more practical example. Hopefully this gave you some insight on how you can use CSS and HTML to build a great looking web page. I hope this practical approach both challenged you and allowed you to learn a few new things about how we can build web pages.